Meeting number 121 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Those appearing virtually have all been sound tested, and the clerk has advised me that they are all good to go. Before we begin, I would remind all members in the room, when you're not using your earpiece, to please leave it face down in the assigned section. And please avoid, if you can, touching the microphone boom, especially when it's live, because it can create popping and damage the translators. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, according to House of Commons rules. Means people are participating virtually and attending in the room. I would remind all members that those witnesses, you had the option of choosing to participate in the official language of your choice. In the room, interpretation is available using the headset and selecting the language of your choice. Appearing virtually, please refer to the bottom of your surface, click on the globe icon, and choose the official language of your choice. If there's an interruption in translation, please get my attention. We'll suspend while it is being corrected. I would remind members to please address all comments through I, the chair, and wait until I recognize you by name. You simply raise your hand to do that. If you're appearing virtually, use the raised hand icon. Today, as you know, we're starting a bit late. And we have 5 witnesses appearing in the public part of today's meeting on the housing study. Appearing as an individual is Jennifer Kiesmat, President, Chief Executive Officer, Collective Marquis by video conference. Alliance to End Homelessness in Ottawa, Meg McCollum, Interim Executive Director. City of Toronto, Abigail Bond, Executive Director, Housing Secretariat. Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services, Justin Marchand, Chief Executive Officer. And West Group Properties, Beau Jarvis, President and Chief Executive Officer. I remind all witnesses you have 5 minutes, and because of today's reduced time, I will advise you at 5 minutes to conclude your comments, so we'll keep it tight. Before we get, Mr. Rilla, did you have your hand up?
Just a very quick question, Mr. Chair. Can you just advise the committee of the timing of the open meeting today and the in-camera? If you could just give us a timeline, please.
Okay, well, we have in total resources until 6:30, so I cannot move beyond 6:30. It would be my intention to move in camera at around 6:15, 6:10 to 6:15, if that's agreeable.
And Mr. Chair, will each party get their full round of questions today?
You will get at least one round.
Okay, thank you.
With the 5. I will monitor that, and I'll judge the time when we move in camera, 10 to 15, because I would like to get that part of it done.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Just before we begin, I just want to put on record that there's issues with the sound system, and there's the duplication and the sound lag, which is unacceptable. And it appears that the interpretation is not here, and this is an ongoing issue that we have when they're physically not here and they're working remotely.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. And I did, actually, in the name of the Vice Chair, raise that at the liaison committee of the committees, that we were experiencing this, and they assured that they will work on that over the summer. Because I'm getting the delay. It is not convenient. So with that, thank you for raising that. It has been raised with the resources, but I've been advised it is up to quality that allows the committee to proceed. We'll begin with Jennifer Kiesmat. Ms. Kiesmat, you have 5 minutes or less. Oh, come on.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the committee, honorable members, for undertaking this work. Those of us on the front line building new, almost like it's a negative to be mitigated. In the absence of sufficient supply, as you know, we get all kinds of wonky outcomes in Canadian society. Young people leave the communities where they were raised, unable to imagine their future. Newcomers become trapped, unable to access the middle class and the opportunity and
Sure,
stability
the
that
video
drew
and the
them
audio
to
is not.
Canada in the first place.
Just get you to stop for a moment. The quality here in the room is unacceptable for the committee to proceed, so going to move to the next witness, and IT will contact you to address the issue with your sound quality here in the committee room. So we'll return to you. I'm now going to move to Meg McCollum. Ms. McCollum, for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Bon après-midi. I'd like to acknowledge that Ottawa is located on the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory and is also the home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Put simply, these lands were stolen from the traditional keepers for the purposes of settlers. Dispossession of land is just one form of ongoing colonization that has led to First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous people disproportionately experiencing homelessness. The Alliance is a member-driven organization representing 75 nonprofit service providers in the housing and homelessness sector in Ottawa. Our members work within systems that have unintentionally caused homelessness to flourish. They have witnessed the changes over the last 40 years as our country has gone from a small number of mostly men experiencing chronic homelessness in the 1980s to a mass problem in the mid-2000s with over 235,000 Canadians experiencing homelessness in a year, including women, families, seniors, and youth, to an explosion in recent years where homeless encampments are a fixture in Canadian communities, and an estimated 10% of people in Ottawa's shelters are employed but can't afford housing. 2023 marked the highest numbers on record in Ottawa's shelter system. Our shelters are full of people unable to find an affordable home. In many cases, they just need affordable housing. Without being able to access this, people get stuck, increasing the number of people in shelter past the breaking point. This overwhelmed system means that those with greater needs, often dealing with serious mental health challenges, are not getting the support they need either. We can't talk about the lack of investment in housing without also talking about the investments made into the homelessness programs and connected systems like emergency services, health and social services, hospitals, and the criminal justice system. Homelessness traumatizes people already in crisis and has negative impacts on individuals, families, and communities. It is much more expensive than affordable housing and the supports needed to keep people housed. The National Homelessness Initiative was created in 1999 to respond to the dramatic growth in homelessness that occurred less than a decade after the funding programs for affordable housing were transferred to the provinces and territories without the fiscal capacity to support them. And we've been funding homelessness ever since. Unfortunately, while homelessness programs are well-intentioned, we can't house people without a housing supply. It's like trying to put out a fire while the gas is turned on and the water is turned off. The housing programs that were initiated in the 2000s have been well-intentioned, but they haven't been strategic. First, under investing in affordable housing program, 470,000 new homes were created from 2000 to 2019. But despite this, in Ottawa, 31 affordable houses in the private market are now lost for each new unit of purpose-built affordable housing created. A recent report on renovictions in Ottawa showed that between 2017 and 2022, there was a 545% increase in the number of eviction notices issued for significant renovations or demolition. We need to protect the affordable housing stock we have. Next, below market rents, BMR, which make up the majority of rents produced under the IAH and subsequent programs, don't begin to meet the affordability needs of people with low income. BMR sets the affordability in relation to what the market can charge, instead of setting it in relation to the income of those who need housing. In January 2024, the average price for a one-bedroom apartment in Ottawa was $2,000 a month. You'd need an income of $72,000 a year to comfortably afford that, which is out of reach for anyone on a pension, receiving social assistance, or earning a low to moderate wage. Finally, there's a disconnect between the capital funding from the federal government and provincial funding to operate supportive housing, which is affordable housing with on-site health and social services for people who need that assistance to live independently. Without the provincial commitment, funders like CMHC tell supportive housing nonprofits that their operating plans aren't viable, and they're right. However, the cost of people cycling through homelessness and hospital emergency wards are much higher than the cost of integrating health services into affordable housing. So whether we're talking about learning from the past or planning for the future, there's some clear takeaways. We need sustained investment in building deeply affordable and permanently affordable non-market housing. Canada needs to double its nonprofit housing stock by 2030 to begin to get a handle on the crisis, and some reports suggest a quadrupling is needed. The recently announced acquisition strategy is a great idea to prevent the loss of existing housing stock. Increasing the percentage of deeply and permanently affordable housing in the housing market will create healthy vacancy rates in the lower end of the market, meet the needs of people who are not served by the private housing market, and will also have a downward drag on market rents overall. Secondly, Canada needs a universal income-based definition of affordable housing so that we can focus housing programs on creating truly affordable housing, regardless of the inadequacy of social assistance rates. Thirdly, we need to manage affordability by creating a national rent control and vacancy decontrol legislation in line with Canada's commitment to housing as a human right. And finally, we need to keep people housed through permanent supportive housing. Je vous remercie pour votre temps et votre attention, and I look
Thank
forward
you
to
for
your
your time
questions.
and attention.
Thank you, Ms. McCollum. I'll go to Abigail Bond from the City of Summerside, and then we'll return to Ms. Kiesmat. Ms. Bond, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to be here today to speak to the committee study on federal housing investments. I'm in Toronto today, so I'm joining from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This place is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. The City of Toronto and its peoples is facing massive challenges across the whole housing continuum, including 11,000 people in Toronto were experiencing active homelessness as of May 2024. This is combined with a shelter system that is operating at maximum capacity on a daily basis and a lack of supportive housing to move people out of chronic homelessness and into permanent housing. We have nearly 87,000 applicants on our wait list for social housing as of Q1 2024. We house only 3,000 of them per year. We have insufficient affordable housing supply to manage current demand and future needs. As income levels have not kept pace with housing costs, many in our city are in core housing need, and nearly 80% of full-time minimum wage households cannot afford to live in Toronto. The federal government's immigration targets of close to 500,000 new permanent residents each year from 2024 to 2025 are something we can support. We need to set up these newcomers for success, including ensuring they have access to affordable housing and a good quality of life. These significant housing and homelessness crises are complex, with various contributing and intersecting factors, including rising rents and homeownership costs, as well as low social assistance rates and insufficient access to physical and mental health supports and social supports, as well as structural racism and discrimination. Nonetheless, these crises are decades in the making and have not occurred in a vacuum. With a lack of sufficient housing investments from all levels of government in recent decades have combined to compound a dire housing situation in Toronto. The majority of purpose-built private and publicly owned rental homes were built more than 35 years ago, beginning in the 80s and into the early 90s. The construction of purpose-built rental housing and nonprofit co-ops rapidly declined, while provincial and federal investments in housing lessened and housing responsibilities were downloaded to municipalities. Today, over 80% of all rental housing is privately owned, with the balance, the remaining stock, managed by Toronto Community Housing Corporation and other nonprofit housing providers. In response to the ongoing housing and homelessness crisis, the city aims to increase the overall supply of housing, and it's essential that we also grow the stock of affordable and supportive housing so that we address the full housing continuum. That is why Toronto City Council has approved a new increased target of 65,000 rent-controlled homes, including 6,500 rent-geared to income homes, 41,000 affordable rental homes, and 17,500 rent-controlled market units, all to be delivered by 2030. The city has already taken steps to unlock housing supply through housing enabling policy changes such as removing parking requirements, expanding housing options across Toronto, including laneway homes, garden suites, and multiplexes of up to 4 units as of right, as well as 6 stories as of right on major streets in our city. The City of Toronto is ready to work with private and nonprofit partners to get shovels in the ground faster and create new homes that meet residents' needs in all neighborhoods across the city. Investing in housing enabling infrastructure as well as public transit are critical as the city is advancing due diligence on over 50 city-owned sites that have been identified for housing development. With the right type of investment, these sites can create mixed income, mixed use, transit friendly communities that will benefit current and future residents for generations to come. Along with our partners, the city stands ready to build new homes faster to deal with decades of pent up demand. Toronto City Council has previously requested an allocation of grants between 500 and 800 million per year and low-cost loans of between 900 million and 1 billion annually from each order of government so that we can together advance new supply under a public developer model. This guaranteed application would provide certainty for projects for immediate advancement. To achieve a generational change and systemic shift in building homes faster, the city knows that we must work closely with our partners, both the federal and provincial governments, as well as Indigenous, nonprofit, and private sector organizations to develop bold and innovative ideas across the housing continuum. Recently, the federal government has made important investments in Ontario and Toronto specifically, including the Housing Accelerator Fund. We are encouraged by policy and financing changes the federal government is considering that would enable more projects to advance at a faster pace. I would encourage the committee in its review of the past to document lessons learned so that can be effectively leveraged today to address what is one of the most pressing national issues. And I will just finish by saying the need for significant action, investment, and leadership at a federal level cannot be understated. Work with us at a portfolio level, not just at a project by project level. And we look forward to Canada Builds being launched in Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now return to Jennifer Kiesmat. Ms. Kiesmat, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Those of us on the front lines of building new housing supply are challenged by the regulatory constraints that treat housing like it is a negative to be mitigated. In the absence of sufficient supply, we know there's all kinds of wonky outcomes in Canadian society. Young people leaving communities where they were raised, unable to imagine their future. Newcomers becoming trapped, unable to access the middle class, and the opportunity and stability that drew them to Canada in the first place. We know that anti-immigration sentiment then grows as a scarcity mentality driven by fear takes root. Housing insecurity has become a defining feature of Canadian life. The well-housed worry about interest rates and property taxes, insecure about the future. They worry about the future of their children and grandchildren. Those well-employed worry about being laid off and the impact on paying a mortgage or paying the rent. Then, too, there is, of course, the vulnerable among us. As an example, domestic violence against women is declared an epidemic in Toronto and elsewhere, and yet women and children, unable to access stable housing, stay with their abusers. I am a founder, owner, and president and CEO of Collective Marquee. We have over 8,000 homes in the development pipeline in the GTA, mostly rental, and we are a self-performing construction company. We build in walkable urban locations close to schools, parks, and transit. We prioritize maximizing affordable housing and accessibility. We have homes under construction and at every stage, and we partner with organizations to deliver complete communities that integrate daycares, community spaces, and recreation facilities. Since April 1st, we have handed over 120 keys to new homeowners. in a 427 12-story building on Wilson Avenue, steps from the subway. This morning, we finalized the acquisition of 2 sites for a 62-unit missing middle building. Construction will begin this year. In September, we begin site works on a 1,500 home development and an infill project, which is an infill project in our suburbs, known as Tyndale Green. This development will benefit from an injection of incentives from the Toronto Housing Secretariat, from Abby Bond, who you just heard. She administered that program, which enables the building of hundreds of new affordable homes. And we have just recently partnered with Toronto on city-owned land to develop 456 new homes, 30% of which will be affordable because of a remarkable partnership with CreateTO, the development arm of the city. This development in particular will benefit from HST forgiveness. It is incentivized, the HST forgiveness incentivized us to transition from a condo development to a purpose-built rental one, and it enables the inclusion of deeply affordable homes. There's 3 key points I'd like to make. We need to stop regulating housing like it is something that we do not want. This problem is both old and it's new. When I was chief planner in the city of Toronto from 2012 to 2018, we approved a remarkable record amount of housing, 86% of which was approved in just 18 months or less. Today, the bureaucracy has swelled, nearly adding a third more, and approval times have slowed. At last count, 16% of developments were approved in 18 months or less. This is a recent problem. There are 3 things I want to highlight. Government fees are undermining the deliverability of new housing. Housing-specific fees and taxes are harming the viability of housing and worsening this crisis. In some municipalities, government fees are a quarter or more of the overall development cost. Just last week, as hundreds of new housing developments are put on hold due to high costs, multiple municipalities across the country increased development charges, including Toronto, with a 42% increase that was planned in very different market conditions. The second key point I'd like to make is that infrastructure costs should not be layered onto the cost of new homes. For years, the concept of growth pays for growth through taxation vehicles such as development charges has been commonplace, and for some time, the market could withstand these costs. Today, this is no longer true. In Ontario, the idea of a municipal infrastructure fund to replace development charges has been proposed and floated. This is a solid idea, worthy of exploration. And lastly, governments should do the thing they can do now, use their own land. Unlocking land is at the root of new housing development. The federal government should incentivize other levels of government to unlock their lands and at the same time lead by example by expediting partnerships to build homes on government land, not unlike the CreateTO example I highlighted earlier. The problem is solvable. We need to think about housing differently and act creatively. We can begin by getting regulatory constraints and high government fees out of the way and using government land to deliver more housing everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Keesmaat. We'll now go to Justin Marchand, Chief Executive Officer, Ontario Aboriginal Housing. Mr. Marchand, 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Miigwech Chair. Greetings, members of Parliament. My name is Justin Marchand. I'm the CEO of Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services. Our organization is the largest Indigenous-led housing provider in Ontario. We have a portfolio of 3,300 rental units and serve close to 11,000 people every day through our housing programs and supportive services. We have over 40,900 people on our waiting list. Our organization was also a founding member of the National Indigenous Housing Collaborative, Inc., or NICHI. OHS was formed over 30 years ago to address the disproportionate housing need among Indigenous people living in urban and rural communities across Ontario, and to exercise our right to develop Indigenous-led housing programs as affirmed in UNDRIP. 3 decades later, the needs of our communities have not been adequately met. Indigenous people remain disproportionately unhoused, underhoused, and inadequately housed. The proportion of Indigenous people living in urban areas has only continued to climb. In Ontario, 88% of Indigenous people live off-reserve in urban, rural, and northern areas. There is an extensive body of research documenting the housing crisis as it affects urban Indigenous communities. First, the final report on the National Inquiry of Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, released in 2019, identified housing as a critical component of safety and well-being. The final report critically mentions housing 299 times. There are 10 calls for justice that refer to housing. In short, the provision of housing is both a preventative measure against violence, and the provision of housing is also a solution to addressing current acts of violence. Second, this standing committee's 2021 report on urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing detailed tremendous need in urban, rural, and northern Indigenous communities. The committee heard that the government's distinctions-based approach to Indigenous investments in the NHS creates service gaps and do not address the needs of Indigenous people living in urban, rural, and northern areas, and that a minimum of $1 billion per year would be required to address Indigenous housing needs in just Ontario alone. Third, the PBO released a report in 2021 that identified there were 677,000 Indigenous households living in urban areas across the country, and of this total, 124,000 Indigenous households are experiencing housing need. Over 37,500 Indigenous people experience homelessness in a given year. Fourth, Scotiabank is acknowledging that Canada is last among G7 nations for housing investments and is calling on Canada to double the level of social housing just to get to the G7 average. Fifth, in 2022, the federal government's own national housing council released recommendations on earned Indigenous housing, indicating a need for $63 billion investment and recommended an immediate minimum investment of $6.3 billion over 2 years. In our 3 decades of operation, our organization has witnessed the hollowing out of federal housing investments and the lack of proactive commitment to urban Indigenous housing policy, despite the data and evidence clearly indicating a significant and embarrassing policy and service gap. Federally, there is no long-term plan to address end of operating agreements, and as a result, we are witnessing the expected displacement of residents living in subsidized housing, an increase in homelessness, and growing encampments. In an era of supposed reconciliation, implementing UNDRIP and addressing MMIWG recommendations, limited federal funding has had mixed results at best. Federal housing funding favors certain geographic areas over others, favors politically based, distinction-based groups rather than based on need, service, and evidence, fails to address the most urgent and unmet needs, and fails to address the disproportionate negative outcomes for demographically disadvantaged groups, thereby perpetuating the practice of genocide recognized in the final report of MMIWG. We can see how these restrictions impact results of federal funding. For example, in the RHI funding, out of 10,000 housing units in phases 1 to 3, in the first 2 rounds of housing, only 12 units went to urban Indigenous housing providers. Recent federal funding opportunities have been tailored to municipalities with eligibility criteria that has been highly exclusionary of urban Indigenous housing providers, and the funding hasn't prioritized the highest demographic need, Indigenous women and their families. OHS recommends that the federal government address the calls for justice in the National Inquiry on MMIWG and the National Action Plan priorities, especially those related to housing, infrastructure, and safety. That the federal government address the disproportionate housing need in urban, rural, and northern Indigenous communities by ensuring that all federal funding is in compliance with UNDRIP, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and allows for Indigenous control and self-determination by Indigenous-led housing providers. Create a sustainable infrastructure program that is cost matched by all levels of government, that ensures federal housing targets for new builds are matched with adequate infrastructure. Establish a sustainable source of operating funding to ensure that supportive housing can be built with wraparound supports to address homelessness and housing inadequacy. Adopt a comprehensive understanding of infrastructure that incorporates funding for community and social infrastructure, including community safety, connection to culture-based supports, education, and employment. And finally, develop a long-term rental subsidy program to support ending chronic homelessness, supporting housing stability, and ensuring the safety and well-being of urban Indigenous people who are disproportionately homeless and experiencing housing need. Miigwech, and thank you for inviting us to your standing committee.
I did not want to interrupt while you were concluding your comments, but we do have bells ringing in the chamber, which means before I can proceed, I have to consult with the committee and get direction. Is it agreeable, Ms. Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's fine to hear from, we have one more witness to hear from their opening statements. So I think we have time here to hear from that witness. And I think because we've had these multiple votes today and because of limited amount of time, I'm sure that all committee members would agree that it would be very reasonable to invite these witnesses back. I know that we've done that with other witnesses at other times, and that the suggestion would be that they would be invited back to the first meeting that we would have back in the fall session in September, and then that gives them a lot of flexibility for that time, because our time will be very limited here with them, and we have quite a number of witnesses that we'd want to hear more from. I'm sure that the committee members would agree with that. I know that we've done that with other
We'll take it
other
one
meetings.
step at a time, Ms. Gray. We will hear from the.
Do we have consensus on that?
I don't.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. We can only take it a step at a time, Ms. Gray. If there's agreement from the committee, we'll hear from the final witness, and then we'll choose after the final witness. So with that, I see consensus to hear. So Mr. Jarvis, you have 5 minutes or less.
Thank you. My name is Bo Jarvis, and I am President and CEO of West Group Properties. We are one of the government's largest housing providers and partners via CMHC rental construction financing program. I'd like to offer a perspective directly from a large Canadian home builder. An important observation: 95% of housing in Canada is built by private sector developers using private and institutional capital. This means most of our housing comes from non-government sources. Yet for decades, we've perpetuated a damaging narrative that often casts for-profit home builders in a negative light. This perception is pervasive across all levels of government, leading to policies overly focused on not quote-unquote enriching developers. I have many examples of this. This is a crucial issue because we're in the midst of a housing crisis, widely acknowledged to be caused by a supply shortage. Our housing paradigm in Canada relies on the private sector, which must achieve a risk-adjusted return on capital to continue building. In simpler terms, developers need a profit to take on the substantial and ever-growing risks of new housing projects. However, years of regulatory expansion have only increased the complexity, along with ever-growing levies and taxes, making home building in Canada extremely risky. In fact, the risk is becoming untenable. Metro Vancouver, for example, is experiencing the highest levels of court-ordered sales of development land in recent memory. Many of our largest home builders are now investing as much or more in the United States than in Canada. Stop and think about that for a moment. In the midst of a housing crisis, some of our largest home builders are building as much or more housing in a different country than they do in Canada. And before we say that's not right, we should try to understand the reasons why. We must urgently change the narrative about private sector home builders in Canada. Sustainable policy creation will not happen until we do. The narrative surrounding the home building industry often contrasts sharply with how the government treats other industries. For example, the recent announcements of tax credits and subsidies for electric vehicle battery plants with companies like Honda and Volkswagen, both for-profit companies, show a clear government strategy in response to the climate crisis. Just as government recognizes the need to incentivize and support the electric vehicle industry to combat climate change, it should also recognize the need to support the housing industry to address the housing crisis. Both crises demand urgent action and innovative solutions. However, while government is willing to offer tax credits and incentives to other industries, it remains hesitant to do the same for housing. In fact, the opposite is true regarding taxation. We must reflect on why private capital is floating out of our country to build homes elsewhere. The answer lies in the general narrative and the imbalance of risk versus reward in Canada. Regarding taxation, many reports, including from CMHC, estimate that 20 to 30% of a new home's cost goes to taxes, with collective government earning more than 3 times what a builder makes, significantly hindering housing affordability and delivery. The Urban Development Institute reports that levies and taxes make up 29% of the average condo price in Vancouver. This doesn't even include the full scope of the new Metro Vancouver development cost charges. Between 2015 and 2027, the City of Vancouver's DCCs will have increased by 130%. Metro Vancouver's DCCs are expected to soar by 1,943%, adding $21,000 per unit. The federal government's role is also problematic. This government is charging GST on almost every input of a new home purchase, including interest on construction debt. Moreover, GST is being charged on DCCs that we pay to the municipalities. The federal government is charging housing taxes on other levels of government's housing taxes. The issue with DCCs is even more concerning as there is little to no in-stream protection for existing projects. Imagine if the auto industry faced similar conditions. A manufacturer buys inputs to produce a vehicle at a certain profit margin, and while working with the government to obtain plant approvals, the same government imposes a retroactive levy on those inputs previously acquired as inventory. This would disrupt the entire business model, and this is exactly what is happening with DCCs and housing. We must change taxation on new housing. Regarding capital, numerous experts' recommendations suggest improving municipal processing time, simplifying building codes, standardizing processes, etc. While these suggestions are indeed vital, the scale of the crisis and our ability to respond effectively are often overlooked. Key to addressing this crisis is the availability of capital, which I believe receives insufficient attention. Numerous reports claim Canada is exporting capital at an alarming rate. Anecdotally, I witnessed the increased frequency of decisions by my peers and colleagues to deploy capital in jurisdictions outside of our borders. In closing, to solve the housing crisis, Canada must attract capital to be deployed into housing by creating an environment with competitive, risk-adjusted returns. Without this, housing projects to the necessary scale will not progress, infrastructure will not be built, and new technologies will not advance. Thank you, and I would love to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jarvis. Okay, we have 20 minutes left of the bells, which takes us 12 minutes to vote. 12 minutes to vote. So we have a choice. The committee can proceed, vote virtually from here, suspend while we vote virtually, and get around the questioning in. Or if we follow the routine, members going to the House, by the time they get back, it will be at 6:25. We have resourced to 6:30, so direction. With the app? With this agreement for committee members to vote for the app.
That's my position. I don't know
With the app, we can't suspend and do that. That's done, but I need unanimity from the committee on that.
Yeah, no. I mean, Mr. Chair, when we even just look at the last two votes that just happened, there were multiple members from all parties that weren't able to vote on the app that had to vote in the House, including whether they were on Zoom or whether they had to race to the House, and that was just even in the last two votes, myself included. On actually the first one, I had an issue. So I don't think it's reasonable, especially considering that this vote is on relating to government legislation, specifically Canada Elections Act. So it's government legislation, and the government is the one that has chosen to vote at this time. They can choose to vote at any time. They could have had votes later this evening, but they chose to do it right now, during our committee time. It's their choice. So we would want to go to the House to be able to vote on this, based on the what's happened already today with the voting app.
Yeah, I know.
But you had your hand up. Madame Chabat.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. D'abord, je tiens à remercier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank our witnesses for appearing today and who had to wait for quite some time to give us their statements. And you can see that the work in the House of Commons is going to move our schedule again.
Translation's working fine. Okay.
Can the members hear the interpretation?
No.
This is the interpreter speaking.
It's in the room. Just a moment. Okay. Madame Chabat, un moment. Good. Well, Madame Chabat, commencez.
Ms. Chabot, you can carry on, please. So, in solidarity with Bonita. Yes. No, I was going to, like you mentioned, it takes unanimous consent. I would have been ready for us to suspend and to go and vote electronically, even though we could question the repetition of votes that we have to redo in the House of Commons. But I mean, I'm ready to vote electronically in order to allow us to use the time that we still have in committee.
Thank you. Oh, but I don't have Madame Chabat. I do not have consent. Without unanimous consent, I do have to suspend until, but I'm not adjourning the meeting. I'll suspend according to the rules, and we'll resume when the vote is recorded in the House. So, yes, so witnesses, we will have to ask you to bear with us for at least 30 minutes. Whoever wants to stay on, yeah, I know, but that's the rules. Whatever witnesses. Witnesses, those witnesses that have other pressing. Well, I can't. There's no sense. 3 hours. No, I will. Those witnesses that have pressing, you were committed here
This
for an hour
is the
and a half.
government's timeline doing this. It's not.
Well, they've already
we want
done
them
that. Order. The committee, I'm going to suspend in a moment because the committee would not give consensus and some members want to return to the chamber to vote, which is their prerogative. I'll suspend, but those witnesses that are still online, when we resume, we may get to you, but that will be a question. So you'll have to judge yourself accordingly. At the time, we are suspended until the vote is announced in the chamber. Suspend. There he is, okay. Thank you, committee members. Everybody is back, so we can resume the committee meeting, but we have 5 more minutes. We must conclude at 6:30 because our resources go to then. So it's not my intentions to go in camera, because to go in camera would use that time. It's unlikely, but I'll take direction on the committee. One item that we can deal with is, this is the last scheduled meeting that I have on this particular issue. So we can move in one of two ways. Is if we do conclude, I would like to give the analyst the opportunity to begin reviewing and preparing a report. So the only way we could provide drafting instructions would be written drafting instructions to the analyst. And I would suggest that we do that and have them in before the end of June. This does not preempt any, if the committee chooses at a later date to examine this study more, it would be incorporated in the final report, which the committee must do. So that's the only clarification that I would like to get in direction from the committee. I will get to you, Ms. Gray, in a moment, but it's not my intentions, and I would want to advise the witnesses. It's unlikely we'll get to a questioning at this time, but all those witnesses that have appeared can provide additional written information to the committee clerk on anything else that they wanted to proceed with. So with that, I have Ms. Gray, and then Madame Cirillo, did you put your hand up? It was Ms. Gray I have, but I'll go to you. Ms. Gray.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And it's obvious that this discussion around housing is very important, and we need to continue this discussion. We know that homelessness encampments are increasing. We saw just within the last couple of days here reports of a surge in people living in RVs and highway rest stops. We know how incredibly unaffordable it is for many people to house themselves. We heard some testimony here today. I think it makes sense to have the witnesses come back so that we can ask them some questions. This meeting was the way it was because of the Liberals and how they're managing their agenda. And Conservatives are willing to work over the summer to continue working on this housing crisis. So therefore, I'd like to move the following motion. Given the amount of outstanding work at this committee, the committee instructs the chair to schedule 5 meetings between July 9th and September 13th in order for the committee to continue its work on Canada's housing crisis and propose solutions so that more Canadians can afford to buy and rent a place to live. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It should be in order.
It is in order. I have a motion that is in order from Madame Gray. Discussion on this. I have a speaking list of Madame Cirillo, Ms. Falk, Ms. Ferrari, and Mr. Fragas-Catos, and Madame Shabat. And the clock is running.
My speaking order wasn't for this motion, Mr. Chair. You can take me off because I wasn't for this motion.
Ms. Falk.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think it's imperative that we meet over the summer. We've heard very compelling testimony, and we know that we need to bring these witnesses back in order to...
So with that, the bell's ringing. Does that, it's still the bells are ringing. The bells are ringing. It is now 6:30. With that, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Well, I'm following the rules, the standing order. The bells are ringing in the chamber, and it is 6:30. Okay. Okay, I'll go back to Ms. Falk.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think it's imperative that we meet this summer. We've heard very compelling testimony, especially in the middle of this housing crisis. And we need to continue to do this work. We know that this committee is very vast. We have multiple ministers that answer to this. So I think, and it was raised in the last meeting actually by MP Long, the seriousness of this housing crisis that we're in. And so I think it's imperative that we continue to meet throughout the summer.
Mr. Fragascatos and Ms. Ferrari.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to my colleague, Tracy Gray, for bringing forward this motion. And I think the motion is critical, and I hope we have the NDP support on this because they have claimed themselves to be the worker bees of Parliament multiple times.
Under the impression there was only resources until 6:30, and it's now 6:30.
Adjournment?
I don't know. Is that the way to do it? Because I need to, call for adjournment then, please.
Will somebody move for the meeting to adjourn?
I'll move for
I
the
would
meeting
call
to
for a
adjourn.
vote, as I have
We're
the
not even
floor.
having a vote? Are you calling for a vote?
Okay, and Madam Clerk, there's a vote called to adjourn the meeting. Madame Thurl? Yes, okay. That's fine. It's quite in order. A recorded vote on a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Fragascatos?
Yes.
Mr. Long?
Yes.
Mr. Collins?
Yep.
Yes.
Mr. Coteau?
Yes.
Mr. Van Bynen?
Yes.
Mrs. Gray? No. Mrs. Falk?
Nope.
Ms. Ferrari? No. Mr. Aitchison?
No.
Madame Chabot?
Oui.
Ms. Zarrillo?
Yes.
Yeas pour 7-7, nays contre 4-4.
Thank you. Simply to advise the witness that appeared, the committee has adjourned. So with that, the meeting has concluded. Thank you. Adjourned.